Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our final panel of today. Really excited for this last panel. We've got some great speakers lined up and a good variety of topics. So I'm going to hand over to Val, who's chairing, and this panel is transnational approaches to teaching screen horror. Take it away, Val.
Thank you, Laura. I'm so happy to join for this panel. It's been a very productive set of sessions, so I'm really happy to welcome my colleagues today. We're going to have a different setup for the beginning or for the first talk, which is a little bit of it on the brief side. So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Orquidea Morales. She is an assistant professor in the School of Theater, Film, and Television at the University of Arizona. Her work on border violence, Latinx media, and horror has been published in journals such as Film Quarterly and Flow. Her work looks at the intersection of Latinx studies and horror studies, and she is currently working on a manuscript that traces the movement of La Llorona in Mexican and US film. So welcome, Orquidea. I will be just taking a backseat right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for sticking around till the last panel. So today I'm just going to talk briefly about a course I designed while I was working at the State University of New York, Old Westbury, which is on Long Island. A little bit about the student population there. It's 26% of the student population is white, 29% is Black or African American, 27% or 10% is Asian American, and 27% is Latino or Latin American. So it is a minority majority institution, which is fairly rare in the US, as you can imagine. However, when I first got there, the curriculum really didn't reflect the diversity. So I was housed in the Department of American Studies and Media and Communication Studies. So we kind of were a joint program in that way. So I designed a master's level course titled Horror Below the Border, Latinx and Latin American Horror, to kind of help make some connections between American Studies, Media and Com, and a developing Latino Studies program that they were creating there as well. So the course was a little bit difficult to design because I was trying to make those connections between Latin American horror films and then what we see in the US. And it was difficult for the students to understand the different contexts and not to fall or use the terms interchangeably, right? Latin American and Latinx are not the same thing. So that was a big challenge throughout the semester. And I'll share my screen just to show a few of the key themes that I hope to cover in the class. And then one of the surprising key themes that ended up being an overarching arch that I didn't plan it to be as I was designing the course. Okay. So some of the key topics that I was hoping to discuss were gender, race and ethnicity, and nationality. Specifically, the course was designed, we started off with Mexico, and then we went to different countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then we came back to the US to kind of see how Latin American horror has influenced Latino-based or US-based Latino horror. So I thought the themes of gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality were key to kind of trace that. But the theme of state violence permeated the whole class, and a mid-semester, I ended up changing some of the films so that we included documentaries. So this is a little bit of what we did. I just wanted to share a little bit of the curriculum. So when it came to Argentina, I had proposed, or we were going to watch The Appeared, or Los Aparecidos, which was released in 2008. And here's a brief synopsis. So this is a film that's a collaboration between Argentina and Spain, and it's a fiction film. And to help them understand the context of it a little bit better, I paired it with a few clips from Our Disappeared, Nuestros Desaparecidos, a documentary from 2009 about Argentina, and they really liked that pairing. So from that point on, I started doing it for the rest of the films. One of the other films we watched was La Casa Lobo or Wolf House from 2015. I highly recommend it. It is a really, really strange and beautiful film. It's about an hour. And in order for them to understand the context, right? Because we were talking about Chile, and then we were talking about a German cult in Chile, which also collaborated with Pinochet, right? So there were a lot of moving parts. So I took segments of the documentary, Sinister Sect, Colonia Dignidad, which was released in 2021 on Netflix. I took sections of that and paired it with Casa Lobo. And this was really fruitful, right? Because a lot of the conversations that we had became about state violence and became about, is horror just visible in fiction films, which is what the assumption they came in with. So we really talked about what the relationship between real and representational horror. And then we ended with the United States. So we watched Culture Shock, which came out in 2019. It's a Hulu original. And in the film, a woman crosses the border and she thinks she's in the US, but really she's in a AI state. So her body is comatose, being fed, almost like the Matrix. But her mind is in this perfect white picket fence, 1950s US. So we watched that alongside Trafficked in America, which is about forced labor. So again, these pairings really helped them understand what state violence meant, and that state violence was something that we also saw in the US. So that really helped make that transition from Latin American context to US Latino context that I was struggling to figure out. So I'll stop sharing and thank you.
Thank you so much, Orquidea, for your outline. I believe it will raise a lot of really productive and interesting conversations regarding this kind of juncture between fiction and documentary filmmaking. So we'll go on to the next panelist, who is Steve Marsden. So I'm happy to introduce Steve. He's a professor of American literature at Stephen F. Austin State University in Texas. He has published on the portrayal of ghost hunting in versions of The Haunting of Hill House, the racialized use of ghost stories by Thomas Nelson Page and Paul Dunbar, and written and presented on the ghost stories of Ambrose Bierce. His most recent conference presentations featured found audio podcast narratology and horror takes on the Breakfast Club. He teaches, among other things, American Gothic literature, horror short story, horror film, and film adaptation. So thank you, Steve. Take it away.
Hey, so I want to talk today just a little bit about teaching international remakes and clusters in the horror film classroom. Now, I don't think this is going to be anything new. I don't think that this is an unusual practice, frankly. So I want to talk just a little bit about a couple of the clusters of remakes that I've taught in the past with some success. And I also want to talk about how I use a class-shared Google Doc as a way to encourage students to engage with the complexity of the film text and context and with each other's insights. So a little bit of context about where I'm teaching this. This is, again, probably quite a bit different layout than a lot of you are working with for coursework. So these are from advanced undergraduate and MA courses coming out of an English department, but they're part of an interdisciplinary film program. So I have creative writers, I have straight English people who will be teachers, and people from the filmmaking department at art. So I teach these in film literature adaptation, international Gothic cinema, and supernatural horror film. Now, during the time that I taught these, some of these are face-to-face, but I also, some of these were taught during the early days of the pandemic. So they're, some of them are Zoom face-to-face hybrids, and some of them are Zoom only sections. As a result, I record everything on Zoom, and then all of those are available to students who have who are missing for some reason because of accessibility. So that's part of this. Likewise, we'll have a 3-film set that takes about 2 weeks. They'll have all of the films made available to them, recorded outside of class for them to watch. And the idea is that they will watch all of these sort of related films together, and then we'll walk through them in the class period. Now, before they come in, they will have added to a shared Google Doc. I'm making what's called a knowledge commons or a research commons for that. So instead of having them do individual notes and responses for each film, they'll put those up on a Google Doc, and that way they can see what other people are thinking. They can also kind of, I'll put up a lot of different sort of questions, specific questions about relationships between the movies. They'll have a place for open observations, comparisons, and contrasts, including making screenshots and labeling those. Sometimes I'll ask them to answer some questions about production or about history, and they can do the research and then link the articles there. And then I just have them sign their last name for real quick check off. So it's more or less a participation score for that, to make sure that they've watched the films before we get into to talk about them. Now, the first bunch that we're going to take a look at are the initial movie release versions of The Ring. So Nakata's Ringu in 1998, The Ring Virus, which is the South Korean Japanese production in 1999, and then Gore Verbinski's American localization, The Ring. So the things that I have them do with this is, first of all, to work out a genealogy of influence. So go back through and they'll get a synopsis of the book. And I recommend that they read the book. If I'm teaching it in an adaptation, I require it. And otherwise, I recommend it. It's got a lot to remove, The Ring, as a novel. So every version is going to take really substantial changes, and then the students will kind of think about the motivation for making those changes. So in the original novel, there's shamanism, a psychic investigation, an intersex gay panic murder by a doctor, a psychic electronic adaptation of smallpox infection, and then finally the investigative side tech in the original novel is a self-attested multiple rapist. So there's an awful lot that each version of this will sort of offload in order to find what is a kind of a more palatable or screenable kind of experience. So one other thing we take a look at is we'll list sort of the fears or anxieties that are invoked in each movie, because each one is kind of harping on very different areas of affect. And then also we'll compare visual style, special effects, visual tone, and palette. So it really gives them an opportunity to show some to get some use, some practice in on their close reading and their comparison. Now, because the Ring Virus and Ringu came out in the aughts, and because there was such a wave of fan reaction, and then such a wave or several waves of more or less accurate critical reaction, this is a great set to let people kind of figure out how to do source evaluation, and also how to use the Wayback Machine with archive.org to find rotted links and to find to bring links back to life that have died. Now, there's a lot for them to take a look at for these localizations. So there's a lot of criticism out there so that they can easily kind of grab it. And the stuff that would require an interlibrary loan, I've already sort of grabbed and put up for them so that they can easily work with it without too much delay. So some of the things we're going to look at is genre and pacing. They'll notice that some of these are much scarier than others, and that particularly the Ring Virus doesn't seem to have much desire to go in for the spook, whereas Verbinski's 30 times budget of the Japanese film is largely used for visual creepiness and to set up jump scares. Some of the good things about a a cluster like this is one that it's got room for student exploration. So if they're interested in the expanded universe of sequels and pop culture tropes and how this like leads to Sadako throwing out the first pitch at baseball matches and so on, they can easily do that. It's also, because these are all sort of coming out within a few years, it's looking closely will give you an easy microcosm of the early days of that sort of J-horror, K-horror, and Hollywood connection. And it's also a good way when we're talking about the relationship between films. This is a good example of films that are using each other's tropes. So each one kind of borrows a little bit from the things that have come out before, but there's not any particular reliance on seeing any particular version first. And it doesn't really seem, partially because I'm giving them so many things with so many choices, that idea of sort of fidelity to the original source sort of falls away. So if in those we're kind of looking at localizations or adaptations or even translations, where, for instance, we'll see Verbinski deciding to go with that sort of famous blue color palette, and when a student was asking me, where I asked a student, why is the Verbinski film so much less meandering than the others? They immediately went and found an interview with him where he said that American audiences demand some sort of resolution or a straight path and are motivated to follow breadcrumbs. So we'll come up with a question, and then they can go and find the interviews and the resources to answer those questions on the doc. Now, if the Ring films are translations, transpositions, or relocalizations of similar themes that are trying to scare different audiences with different resources, the Nosferatu cluster is going to illustrate how later films negotiate with canonicity and tradition, encourage and reward close knowledge and overlay of the original film, and it can be used to draw students to sort of a better sense of the progress of film history. So here we've got our three that I've chosen for now: Murnau's in Nosferatu in 22, Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire in 79, and E. Elias Marriage's Shadow of the Vampire in 2000. Now, by the way, if you haven't seen Shadow of the Vampire, you're in good company, as though it got a couple of Oscar nominations. It fairly rapidly fell off the face of the earth. So you can still get it in a physical medium, but it hasn't streamed anywhere, as far as I know, ever. So it's something that, while Murnau will be familiar to your students, Marriage is almost certainly not going to be. Now, these are useful. The Nosferatu set can be taught within a broader Dracula unit, and I tried that before. I think it works better as a focused unit because, again, the basic structure of the piece stays together. If you wanted to teach about copyright disputes and about intellectual property, it's kind of ground zero, and every version has kind of played with, playing safe or daring people to sue them or being sued into oblivion. So, each one of them kind of plays with that idea of copyright, and it can be a good place for a lesson for that. As I said, a lot of students will be familiar with Nosferatu. It's probably one of the most taught silent films, and German Expressionism is probably, if they have one silent film period, that's what they'll have. There's also new versions expected. So Robert Eggers is going to have one out maybe later this year. And there's been one sort of starring Doug Jones that's been kind of announced as being in post, but it's been in post for a few years. So I don't know when that'll pop up. But it's always good to have these where new entries will be kind of entered into the cluster later. Now, so while the adaptations of The Ring are eliding or localizing elements for a specific audience, Herzog seems to and Marriage seem to rely on adding emotion and context to a less mutable basic structure of the original. So the movie itself stays very similar, but we're adding to it. So Herzog better articulates the vampire's motivations, his immense loneliness and his boredom, his bare and inevitably destructive longing for humanity, love, and contact. We were talking about how the Me Too movement and how modern moments change student interpretations. My students this time very much said that Dracula, as played by Klaus Kinski, has a big incel energy, a pathetic longing, particularly dangerous because of its intrusive demands and its absolute entitlement. Likewise, students appreciated Herzog's development of Lucy Harker's relationship and her interiority. She spars unafraid with the pathetic and intrusive Dracula to try to protect her husband and world. Of course, the worldview in this movie isn't optimistic. Her final sacrifice is made necessary by the utter failure of government, religious, and scientific authorities. And finally, it's futile because her husband, infected throughout most of the film, goes off at the end to spread the vampiric infection after she and Dracula have died. Pandemic era students seemed quite receptive to this. They were like, this maps, this seems real. So Marriage's Shadow of the Vampire remakes as much of Nosferatu as an embedded film. So it shows an alternate film history horror about the making of Nosferatu.
We only have 1 minute. Sorry, Steve.
Oh, okay. Then my gist is, well, the other thing that really hits differently in Shadow of the Vampire this time is that at the end of Shadow of the Vampire, our fictional Murnau is sacrificing his leading lady, who he's drugged and gaslit, and made a deal with the vampire, so that in order to capture the film, he's going to feed his leading lady to the vampire. And again, that's something that I think hits a lot harder now than it did at the time of publication. So again, I think the more kind of versions and closer versions that you can do of a singular work, kind of the more students will see things as choices given at particular times and in particular contexts. Likewise, I think that the Google Doc helps keep everything nicely together so that the actual conversation can be kind of an upper level kind of conversation. And that's me.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that very interesting and super well-structured paper. So I'm confident that we will be able to go a little bit through the way in which this has been applied and so forth during our Q&A portion. So, that is perfect. It's just a timer with a little margin. Wonderful. So I am very pleased to then present our next panelist, Thomas Britt, who is a professor of film and video studies at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. He is the head of the screenwriting concentration and creator of several classes, including Ethics of Film and Video, Global Horror Film, and Advanced Visual Storytelling, all of which sound really interesting, and I wish I could take them. He has received both the Teacher of Distinction Award and a Teaching Excellent Award from the University Stern Center for Teaching and Learning. Recent publications include Death in Modern Film, From the Rattledge History of Death Since 1800, and Came Back Haunted, a great nod to Nine Inch Nails there, From the Streaming of Hill House, essays on the Haunting Netflix adaptation. So take it away, Thomas.
Thank you. My goal with this short paper is to discuss the development of the global horror film class that initially faced resistance from the administrators at my university when I first proposed it a decade ago, but which subsequently succeeded in qualifying as what's known as a global understanding course, which meets a general education requirement for any student at the university if they choose that course. The course Film and Video Studies 300, Global Horror Film, it's now a popular choice for those kind of credits among students from various degree programs, and between 100 and 200 students complete the course each year. That such a class was frowned upon when first proposed might seem surprising in light of the contemporary state of horror in higher education. Indeed, the language promoting this very event points out that horror is a popular subject at the undergraduate and postgraduate levels, that there are specialist modules at many institutions, and that among doctoral research, horror is a growing area of interest. Despite this current prevalence with which we are all familiar, recent history demonstrates that the genre of the horror movie falls in and out of favor with fans, critics, and academics on periodic, if unpredictably timed cycles. To provide context for my own experience with the instability of horror, I will review the assumed downturn that directly preceded my creation of the horror class. I will then detail the efforts I made to address the concerns of the administration and offer some suggestions for ensuring that such a course is flexible in meeting global issues and institutional goals of the future. We could identify a recent period in which the death of horror was announced in the 1990s. There were a handful of critically and/or commercially successful horror films at the end of that decade. If we define the horror genre in loose terms, that would be films like Blade, Ringu, Audition, The Blair Witch Project, and The Sixth Sense. But whereas the crowd-pleasing success of Scream in 1996 had created a fresh space within the industry for horror films to be premised on the reception of horror films, some of these other titles wrestled with arguably more substantial fears relating to longer-standing myths, cultural attitudes towards suffering and death, and the futility or malevolence of technological inventions and interventions. In the year 2000, Paul Wells observed that the end of a century brought with it horror films that expressed the view that although we've progressed in the 20th century, there's still much beyond our comprehension as we entered the next one, and going on to write that humanity still suffers a deep anxiety about the tenuous nature of existence and the lack of what may be viewed as a spiritual purpose. There's an unmistakable existential quality to Wells' reading of a certain segment of turn-of-the-century horror films, highlighting the impression of superfluous existence within time and space that the most effective horror could engage with. But outside of that engagement, there emerged a competing, perhaps more vocal group of critics and academics who felt the horror genre itself had become inessential. There was a widespread impression among filmmakers, critics, and fans that horror movies experienced a slump as the new millennium began. One piece of horror film criticism that efficiently summarized this more downcast perspective was Stefan Handke's Academic Film Criticism, The Rhetoric of Crisis, and the Current State of American Horror Cinema, Thoughts on Canonicity and Academic Anxiety, which was published in 2007. This article is founded in part on the divisive reputation of Scream among horror film fans as being either the best or worst thing to happen to the horror genre. Post-Scream, the author recalls, there was a series of uninspiring developments that threatened to spell the end of the genre, including the neo-slashers of the 90s, the remake cycle typified by the Dark Castle remakes, and the American remakes of Japanese and other horror films from Asian countries throughout the aughts. One impression to take away from Handke's article and the many informed opinions he cites is that the commentary therein involved mostly American or Hollywood horror, with the exception being writers like Peter Hutchings, whose writing during the period represented a more global view and was perhaps correspondingly less judgmental and less certain about the decline of horror. Handke also addresses the particular tenuousness of horror film as an academic subject, which he characterizes as always operating under duress, facing the challenge of legitimizing its subject and by implication itself within a professional field. He says serious, career-minded academics might have always suspected that they were studying something that was ultimately too frivolous, garish, and sensationalistic to warrant serious critical attention. He cites comments by well-known horror scholars such as Carol Clover and Kendall Phillips, expressing their awareness that horror films are not often seen as legitimate and that there is an anxiety about this impression of taking up an illegitimate critical endeavor, despite their reputation. In Handke's estimation, there's a clear, though not often articulated, link between the discussion of a creative slump within the genre and the persistence or revival of anxiety among academics, fearing their subject is not legitimate or perceived as such. A final perspective providing context for the period during which I was developing my own course is Wheeler Winston Dixon's book, A History of Horror, published in 2010. Though the book conforms to some of the horror film text conventions Handke criticizes in the canonicity section of his article, Dixon's book concludes with a speculative section called The Future that describes how the post-millennium horror film landscape benefits from several conditions, resulting in films with more imagination, more originality, and more accessibility. These factors were the rise of the DVD market and other distribution channels such as cable, satellite, and downloads, digital production techniques, and the crumbling of international boundaries. All of these developments that he cites contributed to my creation of the Global Horror Film course. As a film production professor, I had for some time been attuned to the various ways in which filmmaking and film distribution had become more accessible and achievable. but it was during a horror film festival in the fall of 2010 that these conditions within horror movies specifically came into focus for me. The 5th annual Spooky Movie Festival, occurring in and around Washington, D.C., spotlighted a strong group of international horror films that countered the supposed downturn of the genre that seemed like a foregone conclusion to many just a few years prior. A few highlights from that festival included Colin, the innovative no-budget British zombie film that asked the audience to identify with the inner life of the zombie, Dark Souls, a Norwegian horror film that linked zombification with the exploitation and literal regurgitation of fossil fuel, and The Matrimony, a Chinese horror film synthesizing the gothic horror mode with a more contemporary concern about technology and media as a vehicle for ghosts. Spooky Movie 2010 was a relatively small regional horror film festival, but the high quality of its international offerings heightened my interest in starting a horror film course at my university, one that would focus on global issues. So in the spring of 2011, I applied for what was known as the China in the World grant from the Confucius Institute at the university, intending to conclude at least 2 weeks of study about Chinese media and culture in the course I was developing. Having been inspired by the screening of The Matrimony, I began to search for information about mainland Chinese horror film production and found that many of the available texts on contemporary Chinese film did not include significant analyses of the state of the horror genre in China. This absence of coverage gave the false impression that China's national cinema did not contribute to the international horror conversation. I thought it would be interesting to contrast the horror films from mainland Chinese filmmakers working within the specific constraints of the Film Bureau with something like the Category 3 horror films from Hong Kong, which were much freer in what their creators could express. My argument was that there was much to learn from filmmakers working within strict state regulations, both for film students trying to be creative within their own institutional guidelines, as well as for any student seeking to better understand the relationship between the state and the media in China. The Confucius Institute awarded me the grant, which encouraged further progress in the global direction of the course. That brings us to fall 2011, which was my first foray into teaching the course, then tested as a special topics genre class, an experience I've heard more than one of the speakers today discuss that they shared that experience in testing a course. The student response was enthusiastic, with 40 students from various degree programs completing the course, and that combined with the support of the Confucius Institute informed my development of the class as a global understanding course offering. At the time, the general education learning outcomes for such courses included the following: develop understanding of global patterns and processes and their interaction with society, demonstrate understanding of the interconnectedness, difference, and diversity of a global society, identify, evaluate, and properly cite resources appropriate to the field, such as AV, online, print materials, or artifacts, apply awareness of global issues to a consideration of individual or collective responsibilities, and devise analytical, practical, or creative responsibilities to global problems or issues. In my original proposal, I identified the first 3 that you can see on the screen as outcomes that were relevant to my course, explaining that horror films were artifacts that reflect the conflicts of their times and places, that these cultural objects vary in their content and industrial mechanisms, even as they exist within a genre often connected by shared fears, and that the university library's extensive offering of international horror films and academic writing about those films were sufficient to promote the dimensions of understanding identified in these learning outcomes. Nevertheless, the official rejection took place in the spring of 2013, with the General Education Committee in charge of evaluating these courses concluding that it was simply unacceptable for them to approve this course as being a student's sole study in global understanding, because the subject of how differences are portrayed through horror movies is far too narrow a prism through which to view problems of global society. I realized then that I had approached the proposal wrong, especially for an audience of academics not specializing in films, much less horror films. If the committee thought I aimed to express primarily the subject of how differences are portrayed through horror movies, then my proposal had been too shallow in expressing the diversity of global issues I knew were being explored through horror films. Rather than seeing the films as an end, I was interested in illustrating how regional and national horrors and fears influence national cinemas, which were therefore distinct from one another in a global society, as well as capable of influencing one another as a result of global events and/or business practices. In short, national conflict and struggles influenced the works, which then became part of the conversation about these issues, and the distribution of these works across cultures contributed to global understanding. That was my view anyway. Included in the conflicts and struggles on display in horror films are economic tensions, class differences, war, terrorism, health crises, and other global issues, all of which would be the substance of the class. So in my revised proposal, I highlighted this thematic approach to using films as gateways to global issues, addressing the certainty that these global issues would continue to evolve. This approach is consistent with an emphasis Handke urges take place within horror film criticism, not to merely review what the canon is and articulate why these films from history should be appreciated, but to instead invite viewers and readers of horror films and horror film criticism to see their own responses within the context of a historical change, and to encourage them to join the critical discussion of horror cinema as self-conscious participants. To that end, I included a production option within the assignments for the course, inviting students to create a short horror film that explores a topic and/or national cinematic style covered in the class, but also, crucially, to write an accompanying justification for their participation in that topic or style. So they couldn't get away with, for example, just deracinating a style and making it their own. They had to really address the fact of what they were adapting, what their right was to adapt it, if at all, and how they were going to do it in an ethical way. An upcoming shift in the global understanding curriculum at the university will see the previous requirement replaced by global contexts, which includes updated learning outcomes. One of these outcomes sounds much like the course activity already happening in global horror film, which is a class that's now been operating as a global understanding course for a decade. And this new global context outcome reads thus: apply an understanding of one's own positionality within a globally interdependent and unequal world to analyze solutions to global problems. At present, as Hong Kong citizens are adjusting to reduced freedoms, Iranians protest their government, and refugee crises abound, students are encouraged to identify how these issues cohere with the subjects of the class and the cultural artifacts they encounter. In conclusion, if there is a relationship between the popular view of horror films of a given era and the rise or fall of anxiety among academics who have chosen this critical endeavor, then perhaps a good principle for moving forward is to not let the popular impression have too strong an influence either way, and to understand that films of all qualities and from all places are useful in communicating the conditions of nations. The students who take my global horror film course in 2023, many of whom still cite Scream as their favorite or first horror movie memory, were in most cases introduced to the horror film as a postmodern form and have come of age during post-horror, elevated horror, or a new golden age of horror, depending on which cultural commentator one listens to. What most of them have not done before taking this course, regardless of the assumed quality of horror films in their culture, is consciously learn about the world and theirs and others' place in it by studying horror films. And the course remains instructive for them, as well as for me, as I attempt to track the horrors of the world that end up on the cinema screen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And right on time. So no need for the timer to go off. Thank you so much for that very illuminating paper and for sharing those very specific hands-on experiences. So now I'm very pleased to present our last panelist of the day. Diana Anselmo is a feminist film historian and queer immigrant. In addition to various articles on female audiences, she's the author of A Queer Way of Feeling, Girl Found, and Personal Archives of Early Hollywood, coming with the University of California Press this year, and an assistant professor in film at California State University, Long Beach. So, Diana, take it away.
Hi, thank you for being here. It's been like 20 hours for you guys. So my presentation is going to be a little bit more about my methods and a little bit more, let's say, less about like the details and more about how I teach horror. And it's going to be specifically about vampires. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see it. Let me know if you don't, by the way. But this is my presentation. Let me just get this going. So I'm going to be talking about vampires and just how I use vampires to teach particularly issues of intersectionality in a classroom that often is not about horror. So it's like American topics or special topics. And more than one students have come into my class just because they need a seminar, a class or credit and have no idea what the theme is because it's always different. Some people teach it as Westerns or melodramas or comedies. And so they catch that surprise of like, we're learning about horror. And vampires are one of my favorite monsters, quote unquote, to use when discussing horror because they are such a liminal, half monster, half human kind of character. And so I kind of do a stealth vampire course a lot under that umbrella of special topics or American special topics, which are really popular in the institutions that I've taught. So I use this kind of pun, which is normally better learning through, like education, with this idea of vampires as being a monster that can help students being familiarized with international cinema or global cinema, transnational topics, and issues of feminist theory or queer theory. And again, I normally teach electives, which means that I catch junior and seniors in my class, but there's always the odd freshman that can actually like get in there with only half of the prerequisites done. It's always a mystery, and I've taught in way too many universities to kind of like keep track of why that happens, but it does happen, which means that I have a very diverse body of students. I've taught from Pittsburgh to Irvine to Georgia to Portugal, and now I'm in Cal State in Southern California. So my students are often quite a medley of diversity. There's always a contingent of people that identify as queer, non-normative, or neurodivergent. And in Georgia, I taught in Atlanta, it was majority African-American students. Now in Southern California, it's Hispanic. And once in Irvine, it was Asian or IPA identified students. So again, I've taught this class across all of these different kind of populations, student populations, and they seem to really enjoy vampires. So it's a great way of kind of like familiarize them with international cinema, as I said. So I made a really colorful PowerPoint in part because I want you to see how I teach. So it's, like I said, a bit of a methods talk, even more than like a pedagogy directed talk. So as you see, I start classes normally identifying what are going to be my learning goals for that class or for that semester in this case, and what's the objects that we're going to be discussing every week. So this kind of looks like it's an overview of what I would do in like 3 or 4 weeks, but it's just so you see the way that I do methods. And I know it sounds, this conversation trigger warnings that we had previously about how do you infantilize students or how you actually engage them seems to overlap at times. I really like doing what makes me happy, and I always go to a classroom to have a good time, which we can discuss as being a good methodology or a little bit like self-involved methodology. But if I'm having a good time and if I relate to the material, I tend to be a more engaging professor, I feel. So I made these kinds of transitions, these kinds of images. The one you're seeing right now on, it's my right, I don't know if it's your right, but it's a still from the latest AMC interview with a vampire that just came out this Halloween. And so it's being included in this presentation with 2 other movies. The Nosferatu that we've talked a lot more now, a very kind of canonical horror / vampire film from 1922. I like to put that in conversation with a 1960s so-called like cinema marginal film, At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul, made in Brazil, very considered like schlock, low production, shoestring budget, but I like to put it in conversation with Nosferatu, again, because of the high-low divides that are so often attributed in horror, but also because it shows that transnationality, that elements that were being seeded and already recycled in Germany in the 1920s, and will be understood as like the hallmark of German expressionism, kind of were being reused in the 1960s in a counter, kind of like a counterculture, politically activist film, and how these motifs are going to come back. Like, I want to make a joke of like coming back from the dead here in the AMC interview with the vampire in 2022, 100 years after Nosferatu. So I would put all these in conversation across like a few weeks. I would be teaching probably first week the Nosferatu, third week like At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul, and like a few weeks later I'll be doing an interview with a vampire. I like to teach chronologically, just organizes things in my brain, and it seems to do the same for the students. So my main goals, particularly throughout a semester, is to show the continuities of film history across international and genre boundaries, create this international dialogue, and kind of bring up the idea of generic promiscuity that is so important for horror to function. It rubs shoulders, right, and kind of gets together with other genres that you wouldn't expect: porn, melodrama, comedy, teen movies, and kind of like encourage students for a cultural studies analysis of objects. So think of film as a cultural artifact, and in this way kind of introduce them to concepts that are particularly popular in post-colonial theory, feminist theory, and queer theory. So again, weird transitions. I like embedded things. Let's see if this plays and if it works. It does. I'm very satisfied. I'm going to mute it so I can talk through it, which is something I love doing too. So if you can see it here, you can see the images going at the same time. That is an image from Nosferatu. Both of them are, one is a GIF on your right, the other one is just the embedded scene from YouTube. I'm just introducing Count Orlok as an equal opportunity bloodsucker, which means a queer figure that finds attraction both on the right, you have Helen or Nina, depends on the version that you're looking at, and her husband on the left, Hutter, and he's attracted to both of them because of their blood, because blood is precious. So I wanted to show this scene because it's one way in which I started introducing students to the idea that an old silent film is not just a stodgy, funny, hokey thing, or just like a lofty canonical German expressionist hallmark. It actually can be an entryway to talk about queer representation and queer history and queer codes in film. And so here you have him. He's both attracted and will both drink from husband and wife. This is going to be important. Keep this scene in mind because it's going to come back in our conversation of the promiscuity and the long lineage of horror when I tell you about AMC, Interview with a Vampire. So, okay, let me do this. Come on, there we go. So this is AMC. I don't know if you can see it. It says on top, it's a show that just came out on, again, I guess AMC, cable, right, in America. And I want you to look at it because it's inspired by Anne Rice's really popular book, Interview with a Vampire from 1976. And it's now being adapted, and there's a lot of different changes that this film suffered in its passage from page to screen. And part was the race bending of one of the main characters, Louis, which is originally a white European plantation owner in New Orleans. In this adaptation, becomes a Black sex worker provider, like / pimp, in New Orleans in 1910s. The only thing that really matters here is that I want to show you how in episode 4, we have this triad of vampires, which is Louis, Claudia, and Lestat. You see them here in the back, watching a movie in the 1920s. And as you see, they're having a really great time in the back of the movie theater, while the rest of the population in the movie theater is kind of like struck and quiet. They're laughing because they're watching exactly the clip I just showed you, Nosferatu, where now it's 1922 film, exactly the scene where Hutter cuts his finger and Nosferatu gets really excited and attracted to him all of a sudden. Of course, this is the shot reverse shot. They're having a great time. For them, none of this is scary because they're real vampires, and they find this hilarious that there is this depiction in popular culture of this cadaverous, very unattractive male vampire, male-coated vampire prowling this young man. Of course, in the AMC Interview with a Vampire, the two males represented here in a sexual and a romantic relationship, and they've adopted the middle character, which is a female vampire, a teen vampire. So you're seeing here the kind of shot reverse shot shows the representation of vampiric queerness between males, and you have in the audience the so-called lived reality of vampiric homosexuality and how it's kind of mocked as being less realistic by our characters. And we keep with also this representation again of the cadaverous, the hands, the very canonical representation of what a vampire would look like as seen by the imagination of German expressionism. And you have here the characters that live like dandies and very wealthy lifestyle in New Orleans in an interracial relationship. You have them here mocking and having a great time mocking German expressionist Nosferatu. I do this to show to the students again that an old object, which they consider already very dated, and my God, do they ask me not to show them silent cinema because they don't want to look at something with either subtitles or intertitles or without an engaging score. So they tell me they put it at twice as much speed. They watch it on YouTube in their small devices, and they always kind of have a resistance. I'm telling you this humorously, but they have a resistance. So I'm always trying to find ways of engaging them and saying, look, you love this show that just came out and you find it sexy and engaging and beautiful because of the characters and because of the colors. So let's see how they are actually conversing with the earlier piece of media and how that early piece of media can kind of actually texture and even elevate your engagement of the latest 2022 adaptation. So this is just to add to this conversation, instead of just doing a compare and contrast of the past and the current or the old and the new. I also like to show them that it's not just a conversation between quote unquote Western or first world countries, right? That the conversation on horror is way more porous and incorporates a much more diverse global demographic and filmmaking industry. So At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul, the 1964 Mojica Marins Brazilian film, takes kind of very humorously, but also politically engaged these topics of religion, sexuality, race, class divisions that we're already seeing populating Nosferatu, and we'll see even more humorously and overtly displayed in Interview with a Vampire, the AMC version. Again, I'm just going to show you quietly, I'm going to show you the trailer. The original Brazilian title is At Meia-Noite Eu Verei Sua Alma. And I just want to show you here how I show my students the same tropes that kind of created that image of high art German expressionist vampire, how they're being appropriated by a film that was made in 1960s, but in a time of dictatorship in Brazil. It was a film that was heavily censored, that was not allowed distribution for a very long time. So it was a film that was being made with very great awareness that the political climate at the time did not want horror movies, let alone horror movies that criticized religion, Catholicism in this case as one of the main ones in Brazil, although there's way more diversity and indigenous practices. So it tackles that. It tackles this idea of the man, this main character that is a human, but wants to be a vampire, so it can have the power to destroy the ones that he finds inferior to him. He really borrows all these markers of dandy culture that are associated with particularly Anglo-American privilege to oppress his Brazilian counterparts, which he sees as inferior because they are indigenous, they are of color, or they are poor, or they're working class. And he wants to create a distinction by associating himself with a monstrosity that became popularized as suave, elegant, and desirable in films like Nosferatu, but also in others such as, yeah, look at this. I'm really amused by all these like little tricks of PowerPoint. They're so early 2000s, but I'm having a good time with them. So here I want to show you at the right most, you see Coffin Joe, the Brazilian monster that is clearly borrowing tropes from those that have been encoded in the vampiric aristocratic monster of Nosferatu at the leftmost, and then of course Bela Lugosi in the 1931 film Dracula. And again, they are figures of otherness and foreignness to Western culture. They are figures of monstrosity. They wear it on their skin, particularly in Nosferatu, but they are also figures of aristocracy and privilege that are clearly borrowed when Brazil tries to create their own national boogeyman. And they are a way of me introducing students to critiques of like global South being seen as inferior by Western culture, the white privilege of classical Hollywood filmmaking and German expressionist filmmaking, but also the ambiguities about gender and masculinity and violence, and women being often seen as the ideal desirable prey. So all of these kinds of things can be brought in by putting these three films in conversation. And I kind of round it up by bringing it like the contemporary adaptation of the AMC Interview with a Vampire.
We have 1 minute. Sorry, Diana.
I have 1 minute. I'm wrapping up. So this is my last slide. I think I have two, but anyway, horror as an entry to culture studies analysis. This just is an image from the first episode of Interview with a Vampire. And I put it in conversation by showing that the clothes are clearly inspired by Leindecker's Arrow Color shirt ad, and both the character on the left and the illustrator on the right were queer. So again, showing that queer history can be found in vampire and horror objects, and that mise-en-scène and costuming, for example, is a great way of talking about the intertextuality of not just horror and vampire figures, but also of media and how even art history and film are related. Last but not least, I like to do these kinds of showing of vampires as being a very embodied genre, right? And showing the parallels between race and queerness and how it's embedded in the fabric of horror. And I just want to, again, it seems like I'm paid by AMC by selling their new show. By the way, it is streaming now, and we'll get to Europe in the first week of January, I hear. But I just wanted to show it how it has become a great object to talk about race, particularly in America right now, where, as we know, anti-Blackness and Black Lives Matter are a prevalent topic in the classroom, and how it's particularly interesting because in this couple, as you see, it's an interracial couple, but this main character, Louis, and being Black, now quoted as Black, is going to be a great way of talking about even the hypocrisy that exists within interracial relationships that are depicted on screen. Because you can see here, he's putting in front of his saloon that only colored people are allowed, whites are not allowed, while being partnered with a white man that is at this moment inside of that saloon paying the bills. So just again, better learning through vampires and the conversations that can be problematized in the classroom by incorporating vampire media in your syllabus. The end. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation. I keep seeing all these different threads connecting what you have talked about, all of you have talked about. So, excuse me. Now it's time to open the floor for different questions and comments. So if you have a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function or just pop it in the chat and I will be happy to make it extensive.
Yeah, I can only speak for myself, but I did not look at the chat all this time. So.
Laura, please go ahead.
There was a lot of really interesting discussion going on in the chat, actually, Diana. You may just, it's a lot to scroll back through, but mostly a lot of love for vampires towards the end. I had a question for Steve. Thank you very much, everybody. I really enjoyed those papers, and I think that was a fantastic panel to end the day. Steve, remakes, teaching remake clusters and adaptation. I do quite a lot. It's my area, and I really like a point that you made about the ring, in that one of the nice things about teaching clusters is that there's no kind of requirement for students to have kind of a version preference, that they can kind of come in at any aspect. We don't have to watch the original first, that we can think about it in reverse, or kind of think about these different versions kind of very intertextually, and I really like that aspect. So I just wanted to ask, actually, whether it transpired that they did have a preference for any particular version. That was the first part of my question. And the second part of my question, I didn't know if you've seen that I put in the chat about Matt Hills's chapter on kind of version preferences of the ring. I didn't know if you've encountered that before, because that's really close to that point. Right.
I found that they really did not like the ring virus. So that's our South Korean version, which is much more of a detective story still. It's made a lot of choices that the Japanese movie didn't make, though it makes some of them. So they did not really seem to, I think, particularly because the scares weren't played as scares. You know, I just don't think it, somatically, I don't think it pushed any of their buttons. So when we were going through the scary parts in class, I didn't see them make the little shudder that indicates that the thing landed, right? Between the Japanese and Verbinski's, it was about evenly split. So some students really liked the more expensive Gothic texture of the visuals, the kind of more attention to little micro scares and little, the way that they've kind of put $48 million worth of interest additionally onto that film, but a number of them were I don't know whether they were sort of people who are like, whether purism had anything to do with it, the fact that they liked the Japanese better because it was subtler and less dictatorial and kind of more meandering. So it was kind of a split, but the ring virus got very little love. Really, yeah, it's really interesting that it was a really kind of clear split between the other two, though, and I think there is a perhaps like you were saying about I think it was Thomas actually was talking about kind of elevated horror and various other examples that maybe students are kind of responding to some of that studio horror backlash at this point in time, that kind of studio popular horror which the Ring kind of belongs to in a particular early 2000s way. And I do wonder whether there's perhaps some of that backlash there that makes them more interested in the more subtle
more subtle versions of the Japanese version. Yeah.
And one other thing, I think that a lot of people, that kind of very green-blue palette, I think its moment has come and passed. And I think that it's kind of either a flag of nostalgia for that moment in cinema, or I think there's a little backlash to that too, where people kind of prefer a less restricted palette.
Absolutely, yeah. I think everything around that time seemed to either have that kind of greeny blue kind of color grading, or sort of tobacco-y kind of sepia tones as well as the like
nostalgia tone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we remain open for other questions. I'm also tracking the chat in case someone wants to pop their question in there. I'm just keeping an eye on both things.
I have a question actually, because I'm kind of like hearing people talk in this chat, and my brain is kind of overwhelmed with all of like the writing, but I would love if people want to contribute silent film that their students got into, because I was just writing in the chat that we're trying to create a silent film class that attracts students. So I'm just wondering if it's horror, if it's something else, if someone has suggestions, whether it's speaking or writing, I'll be very welcome to hear them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point of entry. If there's anyone in the audience that would like to share their suggestions, we're of course open to have them in the chat, or to use the raise hand function as well. But staying mindful that someone might also raise their hand in this process. Something that, if I may, really caught my eye is this kind of common ground that these papers have about the usefulness of contrast and comparison as pedagogical tools, as ways to contextualize or to establish that sort of dialogue. And I think that this particular point of entry to teaching, I find it very fascinating. I often don't do it myself in that format. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how the students are also relating to this sort of logic and comparison contrast, because it seems to me that, Steve, your students really did take the ball and ran away with it.
I think it's an easy way for them to go, right? Because first of all, they're going to be watching those movies very, very quickly, usually back to back, if not over a couple of days. And so you sort of get a sense where it gives you those little, a little burst of intrinsic motivation, like a little high when you go like, oh, I recognize that. They didn't do it that way. And it's one of those kind of analytical feedback things that I think I can get students in on really pretty easily, right? So everyone will be able to see those similarities. And if it's up on the Google Doc, a lot of times they both work together to kind of put together what they all know, which is great. But sometimes they also get a little competitive. So you'll have kind of people trying to show how close they can look at something. And that's the kind of competition I'm glad to see develop, actually.
Yeah, I wonder if the panelists have more to share on this regard.
I've done a few for the Latin American horror course. I've done a few original remakes. So like Darker Than the Night, we did the original and the remake to talk about like the changing political landscape of Mexico. So they've been really helpful documents. I'm treating them almost as documents of those changing politics and things like that. One of the films that I used to transition from Latin America to the US context is Dracula, because I show them both Draculas, the English and the Spanish version. And we talk about the politics of representation and the connection of Latino identity in the US to Spanish language, even though that's not necessarily the case, right? So the complication of what it means to be Latino is really clear in a 1930s film, which they never thought would happen. So I think that those older films are really helpful for them to understand the long-standing history of these conversations, right? It's not something new, but it's something that they're connected to from this long kind of like trajectory.
Yeah, and I see you nodding, so you might have some.
Yeah, I was thinking that's such a great point. I've done that as well. I haven't done it in such a long time, so thank you for putting it back in my mind, because they even use the same sets but force the Spanish crew to film like in the back hours, right? Like it's even the production history is a history of like discrimination or different ways of thinking.
Exactly. Yeah, because they filmed that night with the same sets, and sometimes the director didn't speak Spanish, so they had a translator for the director. And it's just like, why didn't you hire a director that spoke Spanish? And then the pushback, right, of these minority audiences that you assume aren't going to be critical, telling you they all speak different types of Spanish. What are you doing? It's just, I think, empowering for students to see.
If I may just interject. Oh, sorry. I find this because it resonates so much. I'm thinking about with this kind of creation of, and I hope I'm not straying too much from the topic, but this kind of sense of the Latino market. Like just from that moment, we're able to sort of encompass the industrial part of it and the cultural part of it, and this phenomenon of the Latino enough sounding director. Because you want to be different, right? But not too different. So it was, I mean, I just wanted to put that out there because I love the Dracula comparison. But to keep on opening to our panelists, if you have to share in this regard. Sorry, I had to mute myself a little bit. In this kind of conversation regarding the contrasts, and the different ways in which these work. Something, and of course, please feel free to pop more questions to our audience if you want to use the raise hand function. So I don't want to take up all the time, but something that really stood out to me as well as a point of commonality between all of your papers is this awareness of how to make the most out of this very diverse classroom, right? There is an acknowledgement and there is an awareness of how these classrooms are configured. So I would like to, I mean, if you have something to share or reflect on it, I would be very grateful to pass the mic.
I'm redeveloping the course now I'm at the University of Arizona, so it's a different demographic, and I'm redeveloping for undergraduate level. And one of the things that I'm changing is I'm centering indigeneity more, and I'm being more conscious of it because we do have a lot of Native students. So that's a way for them to kind of include themselves in the narrative, because the final project is a creative project. So when I first taught it, they did art inspired by it. Someone shot a short film inspired by the films. So I want them to be able to do that, right? Like bring in their positionality to make those connections.
That's a great point that I'm actually wondering again. It's just a question. I don't know if this is like, if it runs away, but like, and if you did this in the morning, I'm sorry, I was passed out asleep in California. But which kind of when you ask assignments within the bracket of horror, how do you deal with content that can be deeply offensive, like rape, without being properly contextualized? But it's under that idea of, well, it's horror. Our domestic abuse, rape, like racism or like slurs are part of their texture. It's part of like the makeup of the thing. So I can get it out there, and I can create a creative project that kind of like puts it out there. How do you guys deal with that as a professor and a grader? How do you grade it? How do you watch it? I don't know if you've had those issues when you do creative projects, but I was just wondering.
The few times I've done, so in my adaptation course is the only place where I have a slot for that, where instead of doing a study of an adaptation, they can do an adaptation of some scenes and some, maybe some pre-visualization and stuff. This is probably the coward's way out, but they do a daily work where they propose exactly what they're going to do and why it's good to do and why it's, what audience it's going to reach. And, so they've kind of given me a bullet point list. And if anything turns out so squirrely that I don't think other people in the classroom would feel comfortable like peer reviewing it. Like I think if it was going to make a legitimately hostile classroom, then I would just nudge that kid away from that topic. But and I mean that's tyranny, but
No. I appreciate the nipping in the bud advice, because I would think that that's the right way to go about it. But thank you for sharing. I'm very curious because I've had these accidents. Even people writing like about fan fiction, which you'd think if you're going to approach that as a topic, you have like a really relaxed attitude towards it. And then it would be like, these two men have taught this woman what pleasure looks like. And I'm like, oh, no, don't write it like that. And it's too late. So I totally appreciate.
I think too, I always ask them to write like a critical essay and a reflective essay to go along with their creative project, so that they have to be constantly aware. So scaffolding, like Steve said, is a great way to catch it early, but also asking them to check in with themselves. And you'd be surprised at how, or I have been surprised at how scared they are, or not scared, of cautious they are of not embarrassing themselves in front of us because they don't care, but embarrassing themselves in front of other students. And I think that really helps too. Like they are somewhat aware of that. But other than that, I let them do as much as and as weird as they want to do, as long as they can support it somehow critically.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, it can be a teaching moment. I guess that's what I'm also gathering from everybody that is talking. I love thinking about that a moment where you are like, oh, or like you think maybe they'll embarrass themselves. It actually can be a teaching moment for you and for them. Like you're both learning skills. That's great. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, and I think precisely on that line, it just dovetails so well with everything that has been discussed throughout, right? This kind of two-way street when we're teaching. And this kind of awareness that we're also ourselves learning in order to not only navigate the shifts in discourse and the shifts in cultural preoccupation, but also to provide that sort of awareness. And I love that Orquidea brought up positionality, because we're always in that in that place as well. But if there are no more questions from the audience, because I don't see any little raised hands here, just inviting you to make any finishing comments. If you have anything to add, please feel free to do so. Yeah, we're all good. I think it's been a long a long day, but thank you so much for this very illuminating conversation. It has been really wonderful to see the processes of other people and how you are also constantly negotiating this in your own classrooms from the point of view of the horror scholar, but also of a compassionate horror scholar. So thank you so much for everything learned today. Just leaving then up to Laura and Shellie. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Val, for excellent sharing, and thank you everybody for a brilliant panel. What a way to end the day. I think Kate should be with us as well. If I can just, yeah, there she is. Excellent. Okay, we're just going to wrap up just with some closing comments here. I just want to start really by saying thank you so much to everybody who's come along today. We've had so many excellent speakers, fantastic questions, lots of varied discussions, not just within the panels themselves, but also in the chat. I don't think I've ever seen such an active and productive chat. And while I remember, I think what we'll probably do is download the chat and make sure that we upload that somewhere so that everybody can still access the discussions, because I think there's been lots of useful links and various other things shared throughout the day. So yeah, fantastic. And we're sure that you'll all agree, or we hope that you'll all agree, that it's been a day that's given us lots of food for thought, lots of very productive discussion and collaboration and ideas. And it's been really great to learn so much from this symposium and from you all about your teaching and learning of screen horror. And I definitely feel that there are things that I want to take away to my own practice after today. which is good. When I had the idea for this event and I started developing it with Kate and Shellie, I was a little bit nervous about it, I'm not going to lie. We are, of course, all pedagogic practitioners in that we all teach, but you know, we're three academics who tend to think of our own horror expertise as being very much research focused. And I think that increasingly the neoliberal university environment pushes this divide between research and teaching, and if you're a person who balances research and teaching, I think that can be very difficult to navigate. So it's been great to be able to spend some time reflecting on my own pedagogic practice and the connection between my research area, which I love, and my teaching methods, and I'm feeling like I've learned an awful lot from people today, so thanks again. I'm very proud of it all and I'm very pleased with how it's all gone. We were really overwhelmed by so many fantastic submissions, more than we could have possibly fit into this already very packed day, and it was very packed, so we're not going to keep you for long. But we did just briefly want to pull out, we each just wanted to pull out a thread or two that of kind of key areas that have been particularly useful or interesting to us today. And for me, I was really pleased to hear so much on practice-based teaching and the connection between theory and practice and how we integrate those two. I work in a creative arts department on a practical film and TV course, which has its challenges when you're from a critical contextual studies background. But I really love working with students who are very passionate about their own practice and helping them to develop their contextual appreciation and understanding and to apply that to what they're making as well. And Lindsay picked up this idea in the opening workshop about how if we were once told that academia required us to publish or perish, it seems that increasingly we might be shifting to a kind of practice or perish mode with a focus on developing practical skills, industry connections and experience expected not just of our students but also of teaching staff as well. So as somebody reflecting on applying my knowledge to new ideas and developing my skills, reframing my expectations around what a career in higher education can, should and will be, I really appreciated hearing from everybody in those areas today. So yeah, thanks very much everybody. I'm going to hand over to either Kate or Shellie, whoever's next up.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, one of the best things about today is how, I guess because of the online format, perhaps we've had panelists and delegates from very different disciplines who have all approached the genre and using the genre in teaching from lots of different perspectives. And I think what that's done is it's helped us to have some really vital and really interesting discussions around compassionate teaching and trigger warnings or content warnings and trauma as well. So connected to that idea of approaching from different perspectives and viewpoints, we're also really appreciative to have had so many delegates and speakers from all around the globe, and how this, particularly in our post-lunch roundtable session and some of the other panels, kind of sparked a bit of debate around how horror can be and is taught differently in different contexts. Excuse me. So with that in mind, if any of you missed any of today due to time zone differences or other commitments, then don't worry, we've recorded all of the sessions today. The videos of those will be uploaded soon on our BAFTSS Horror Studies Special Interest Group website. I don't know if Kate or Laura can maybe post the link to the website in the chat for me. And it's also, we also have a YouTube channel as well where we put up, we'll put up this symposium. We also have our previous symposium that we did around Yellow Jackets and our monthly events as well. So we will announce when those videos are up and available to view on our social media pages as soon as we can. Before I hand over to Kate, don't forget we also have had a Twitter hashtag for this event, which is #HorrorPedagogy. So if you search that on Twitter, that functions not only as a really nice record of today, but as a place where you can keep talking and keep contributing to the conversations that have emerged from today and been highlighted by various different people. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Shellie. And the strand that I just wanted to add into the mix that I think has crossed the day is, you know, the range of really incredible insights that we've had from everyone about using horror as an extremely effective teaching tool, whether, you know, inside a horror module or outside of it. So, for instance, and I'm sort of scratching the surface here, but, you know, across the day, we've talked about, you know, using horror to teach aesthetic theory, feminist theory, queer theory, theories of race, ethnicity and class, philosophy, adaptation, transgression, English as a foreign language, composition, and also to touch again on something Shellie said, with regards to kind of reflecting on a range of public and private traumas and experiences, as well as allowing students to reflect on those in various ways. And, you know, as a couple of people mentioned earlier in the chat, kind of in jest, but I think it's important to emphasize this, that this really kind of illustrates the wide range of ways in which we can champion our research expertise in horror as having this kind of incredibly wide pedagogical applicability. So I think that, you know, returning to some of the things Laura was saying, I think that's been evident through the wide range of ways in which we've been able to talk about using horror as this incredible pedagogical lens. So, you know, these are just some of the thematic strands that have crossed the papers and presentations today. But as we mentioned right at the top of the day, we are hoping that we can feed some of these thematic strands and insights into a planned special journal issue coming out of this symposium, hopefully publishing that with BAFTSS journal open screens. So if anyone has any ideas about particular directions that we can go in with that, we'd love to hear from you. Please get in touch with one or all of us if you have any thoughts about that. And yes, pedagogical applicability at this time of day was quite an ambitious phrase to say, but there we are. The three of us will continue to discuss this as well, though, and we'll be in touch with thoughts and updates about these discussions, because we don't want them to disappear and to vanish. Obviously, we've got the recording, but we do want to take this further into a journal issue. So we're very much looking forward to doing that.
Thank you so much to everybody. I think we're done. Shellie, Kate, unless you have anything else you'd like to add?
Just to thank everyone for just a brilliant day. It's been wonderful.
Really has. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, and see you again.